Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 23rd of March, where I wanted to put some closure on Oedipus the King and begin with Shakespeare. So as you know, with Oedipus the King, we talked about how he was a great individual above and beyond the ordinary, who experienced a fall in part because of flaws in character, also because of outside forces. Ultimately, the tragic hero accepts responsibility and the audience feels both pity for the tragic hero and also fear for the tragic hero. So this is review. And we talked a little bit about some of the themes, vision and blindness, just going through the play and seeing all of the references to sight or to light and all of the references to dark or to blindness. Irony, which is why it's so important that we know the plot ahead of time so that we can appreciate the irony of Oedipus's words right from the very beginning of the play. We know what Oedipus doesn't know, that he's guilty. Fate versus free will, some of the philosophical topics of the play. And also discussing quotes, which is what I wanted to talk about very briefly. I had indicated that in terms of family, another theme in the play, that Oedipus is a tragic hero in part because he is concerned about the welfare of his community more than his own welfare. The exact opposite is true of Jocasta. Jocasta is concerned with the welfare of her nuclear family, but doesn't view the community as her extended family, which is what should have been in terms of a ruler, that ultimately a ruler was responsible for the welfare of the people. So Jocasta could never be a tragic hero. And we know right from the very beginning of the play, and note that the play is broken down into line numbers. However, as you know, we're reading a translation, so each translation is going to have different line numbers. So when you are referring to Oedipus the King, when you're writing about it, you need to refer to the page number, much like you usually do when you are writing on, let's say, short story. Will be a little bit different when we get to Shakespeare, though, because Shakespeare's plays are divided into act, scene, and line. And they aren't translations. These are the originals. So we can refer to the act, the scene, and the line in Shakespeare's play, which I will discuss over the next several classes, rather than talk about the line number. But since you may not necessarily be using the edition of the text that I had ordered for us to read for class, I'm going to use the line numbers of Oedipus the King so that if you're using an earlier edition or a older edition, you still should be able to find it based on line numbers because it's the same translation based on the textbook. And in line 63 or so, or actually more like 66 or so, Oedipus begins by telling the populace that, I know you're all sick, yet there is no one of you, sick though you are, as sick as I myself. And he's quite right, but he has no idea how literal that is. Oedipus says around line 155, which again should be something that's consistent regardless of which edition you happen to have of the textbook for class. Oedipus says, I will bring all of this to light, the idea that light brings insight. But of course, we find out that light also brings pain and despair once the truth is revealed. When Oedipus confronts Tiresias, who's the blind prophet, Tiresias is pretty clear around line 395. I say you're the murderer that you seek. And of course, Oedipus doesn't want to believe that. We talked about some of his flaws, his denial, his anger, and his refusal to use reason or rationality. The chorus talks about in line 583 or so that I have no eyes to see what princes do. Again, this idea of eyes, and it's possible to have vision, physiological vision. That's what Oedipus has, but he doesn't have insight, as opposed to Tiresias, who is blind. He can't see, but he has insight. And at the ending of the play, Oedipus will be like Tiresias. He will be blinded. That's why it's so important that he gouges out his eyes from a thematic perspective, as well as taking responsibility for his actions, which is necessary for a tragic hero. But Oedipus gouges out his eyes, but ironically he has insight and becomes much like Tiresias. The idea that he's blind, but yet he also has truth And Oedipus ends up fulfilling the prophecy in that he becomes basically someone walking on three legs. Not a cane because he's old, but a cane because he can't see. So, and of course, that was the prophecy that led to the establishment of Oedipus's great riddle-solving ability prior to the course of the play that establishes Oedipus as above and beyond the ordinary, much smarter than the average person, which again begs the question, if he's so smart, then why would he not realize the truth sooner? But that goes to denial and blindness and so forth. So Jocasta talks a little bit, several times, but the point that I'm referencing is around 777 or so, about how ultimately robbers killed King Laius at a place where three roads meet. And I would say that these three roads are quite symbolic in this crossroads, because they represent Oedipus's parents, Laius and Jocasta, and also Oedipus himself. And where those three roads meet, ultimately, is where tragedy occurs, where Oedipus commits murder. And, of course, that sets a series of events into motion that lead to Oedipus not just killing his father, but marrying his mother, and ultimately having children with her. Incest, which is a blood crime. So as we go on and we find out that Oedipus has to face the truth, as horrified as he is, we know how he immediately jumps to conclusions with Creon. And he assumes that Creon is trying to steal the kingdom from him. And Creon tells him around line 645 or no, that that's nonsense. Who would choose to rule and fear rather than rule and sleep untroubled by a fear, power not equal to both cases? I at least was not born with such a dramatic yearning to be a king. In other words, there isn't any reason why I would choose to be king when I've got all of the benefits of being a king, but none of the responsibilities. Who would choose to be in rule and fear, as opposed to be part of the royal family and sleep without having any consequences? And of course, as we go on, we realize the truth. Everyone does. Finally, even Oedipus himself has to realize it, and his response after Jocasta commits suicide, which would be seen as a cowardly action and trying to avoid responsibility. This is in line 1340 or so. He tore the brooches, the gold-chased brooches fastening her robe, away from her. Lifting them up high, he dashed them on his own eyeballs, shrieking out such things as, "They will never see the crime I have committed or have done upon me." Dark eyes, now in the days to come look on, forbidden faces, do not recognize those whom you long for. With such imprecations, he struck his eyes again and yet again with the brooches. And of course, we know that thematically this is so significant that he's gouging out his eyes. We also know that this action has to be told to us by the chorus, not shown to us, because it would be too difficult to stage such a thing realistically. And then at the ending of the play, where Oedipus shows concern for his children and says to his daughters around line 1551 or so, "I weep for you. I cannot see your faces. I weep when I think of the bitterness that will be in your lives, how you must live before the world. At what assemblages of citizens will you make one? To what gay company will you go and not come home in tears instead of sharing in the holiday? And when you're ripe for marriage, who will he be? The man who'll risk to take such infamy as cling to my children, to bring hurt on them, or those that marry with them? What curse is not there? Your father killed his father and sowed his seed where he had sprung himself and begot you out of the womb that held him. These insults you will hear. Then who will marry you? No one, my children. Clearly you are doomed to waste away in barrenness, unmarried." And as I discussed earlier, at least the boys can support themselves, but without marriage, it's not likely that the girls are going to be able to sustain themselves. So their lives are ones that will be filled with despair, or likely filled with despair. Though we know that Creon shows some empathy at the ending of the play, When we get to the next play out of the trilogy, which happens to be Antigone, I believe it's included in your textbook, we see a very different Creon. Instead of a reasonable and rational Creon, we have one filled with anger and with denial and blindness, which leads one to the question of how does the position of kingship actually change an individual? Because in the second play, Creon has been king for quite a while. So, nevertheless, in terms of today's attendance question, I thought we could put closure onto Oedipus the King. So you can see in the notes below our attendance question, which would be due on our class discussion form on Saturday at noon. Do you have any questions about Oedipus the King? And if so, what are those questions? So if you don't have any questions, you can just say no questions, but I wanted to make sure that you understood the play. Again, as you know, we're reading translations. We saw a production that was translated by William Butler Yeats, the very famous poet. So that translation was quite sophisticated and poetic. We saw very briefly a BBC production, which has a much more contemporary translation in order to appeal to a more general audience, because the BBC would have shown this on British television. I suppose the translation you have in your textbook is sort of in between those two extremes of the two performances that we saw. And again, each translation will be different. It's less about the specific language and it's more about the themes and the story itself. And this leads us to Shakespeare, where I wanted to give us a little bit of background before we begin watching the play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. You should be receiving an email shortly, if you haven't already, from the GCC library indicating how you can stream the performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream. The performance that I wanted us to watch would be a performance that was actually performed in Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Globe Theatre, but there are copyright issues associated with that performance, which is why I have to go through the GCC library. But the performance is also available on disc, on DVD, if you prefer to watch it that way. And what I will do is just divide it up into sections over the next several classes so that we can watch that performance and then ultimately talk about the play itself. As you know, a performance is never a substitute for reading. It is a supplement, but I hope by being able to see the play enacted, that would help clarify some of the questions you might have about it. And I'm well aware this is not an introduction to Shakespeare class. It's an introduction to literature class. So I will make sure that we've covered plot, even though the audience may not necessarily have known the plot ahead of time. But we will make sure that we've got a sense of plot. And I'm aware that some of you might have some familiarity with this play. It's one of the reasons why I chose it, is because it oftentimes is done in the K through 12 level. And also it lightens things up after we read such a dark tragedy with Oedipus and some rather dark pieces of short story. I wanted to give something that was a little bit lighter. And A Midsummer Night's Dream is considered to be a comedy, which I will talk about shortly. But at any rate, in terms of Shakespeare, just to give you a little bit of background, we know very little about him, surprisingly little considering the kind of reputation that he has. Most of what we know is based on legal documents and court records. So that gives us a date of birth, April 23rd, 1564, based on a birth certificate. A date of death, based on a death certificate, April 23rd, 1616. So yes, it is possible to die on one's birthday, but it does raise eyebrows. In Stratford-upon-Avon, which some individuals say was the crossroads of trade and others say it was a little hick town in the middle of nowhere. So how is any of this important? Because we have so little information about Shakespeare, lots of conspiracy theories exist. We do know that about 7 months after Shakespeare married, he married an older woman, they had their first child. It was a very rushed marriage that was not necessarily announced in the church as thoroughly as it normally would be. One assumes it has to do with the dates. Obviously, 7 months after the marriage means that the impregnation occurred before the actual marriage ceremony. We know that Shakespeare worked as a playwright. He also served as a bit actor, and he also owned some stakes in a theater company. There's some speculation that he might have worked as a school teacher for some time. There's also some speculation that his father was a glove maker and perhaps involved in local politics. But there are no records of Shakespeare attending university. Shakespeare only attended elementary school. Elementary school at the time was very different than our elementary school. You would focus on Latin and Greek in elementary school. And all of this said, for individuals who believe that there should be more information about Shakespeare, have come up with all kinds of conspiracy theories to try to talk about how Shakespeare was not Shakespeare and that this was just a pseudonym for someone else. Some individuals, I think this is very much a classicist argument, say that someone who didn't have university education couldn't have written these plays. I disagree. I think that genius is born. It's not necessarily taught. But there have been lots of possibilities about individuals who did have university education who perhaps couldn't take credit for these plays, whether they be Christopher Marlowe, who happens to be a fellow playwright who was writing during Shakespeare's time, but writing was just his hobby. He actually was a full-time spy for the Queen. And the way the story goes, he was murdered in a tavern brawl in an argument over money when he was quite young. People like conspiracy theories will say that this was all staged, this tavern brawl, that he got into trouble politically with his spying and he needed a kind of witness protection program. And he went underground and took on a pseudonym. Rather than Jones or Smith, he took on the name Shakespeare and just continued writing. And of course, as he continued writing, devoting himself full-time to his craft, his writing progressed in sophistication. I actually did my graduate work on Christopher Marlowe. Some have suggested a woman wrote the plays and couldn't take credit because play acting and playwriting was seen as kind of unsavory at the time period. So perhaps even the woman of all women, the Queen at the time, Queen Elizabeth, might have perhaps written these plays. And while play acting and playwriting was seen as unsavory, she enjoyed going to the theater, and certainly no one was going to question her about that. And it's a good thing that she did enjoy the arts, or else these plays may not have been preserved for us. Others have suggested it was a member of the royal court, again, because plays were seen as unsavory and of ill repute. Somebody of royal status couldn't take credit for writing these plays. Some have suggested a committee have written these plays. I don't know if you've ever served on a committee, but I have served on many committees. We can't find the time to meet as a committee usually, let alone find the time and the will and the forethought to write 30-plus plays and keep it secret. So most scholars believe that these theories are basically an attempt to try to make drama where none exists, that Shakespeare was indeed Shakespeare. But again, until we have any kind of definitive proof, we don't really, we can't really necessarily say that this is an impossibility. It's just highly unlikely. And until something else is revealed, that's basically what most people feel. But I tell you this because I know that a lot of times people feel pressure about Shakespeare. And usually when they find out how little is known about him, well, then they come to the conclusion of, well, at least we have the plays themselves. Yes and no. In a way, it may not matter who wrote these plays, but the plays, too, have some question marks associated with them. Yes, the plays were written in English, but the plays were written in Renaissance English and Middle English. So it's a different kind of English than what we speak. So during the time of Shakespeare, plays weren't copyrighted in the way they are today. So if an individual wanted to get a copy, a kind of bootleg copy of a play, what they would do is they would hire someone to transcribe what happened in the play. This could be somebody who goes into the audience and writes down everything they see. You can imagine the number of errors that could occur there. Or perhaps hiring a bit actor who needed a little extra money, who might reconstruct the play. And not only might the actor make errors, because chances are they knew their role much better than everyone else's role, but if this was an arrogant actor, they might misremember their role as being a little bit grander than what it was. And there were all of these bootleg copies that were out there, and there was a printing term to refer to them. They were known as quartos, which means cuatro in Spanish, and it basically means four. So if you take a sheet of paper like this, and you were to fold it once, and then fold it again, so that it would look like almost like a paperback book, and it would have four leaves or four sheets of paper. Those would be the quartos, and many of those quartos exist for each of Shakespeare's plays. What was unusual at the time is 7 years after Shakespeare's death, so note that Shakespeare couldn't approve of what ended up happening. His contemporaries got together and tried to preserve everything into one definitive version. That's known as the folio. It's another printing term. So when you've got, again, one sheet of paper, you just fold it once. That's known as folio. What modern-day Shakespearean editors do is they put together all of the versions of the quartos, as well as any versions that exist of the folios, because, again, there would have been multiple editions that would have been printed. And they try to come up with the definitive version. There are a group of plays known as problem plays because they're just that, problems. That there's so much discrepancy between all of the quartos and the folios. They're viewed as problems. They usually aren't studied at an undergraduate level. Other plays, the famous ones, like Midsummer and Hamlet and Macbeth, these are not problem plays. But occasionally when you are reading a play, what you will see is that in the middle of the dialogue will be square brackets. And if you remember the convention of using square brackets when you are quoting, square brackets are to indicate that this was an insertion, not part of the original text. So this is an editor inserting in a word or several words, their best guess as to what that word might be based on the context and based on the rhyme and the meter, the rhythm. And during the time, language had not been standardized the way it was today. Spelling had not been standardized. So you could basically spell words based on mood, which perhaps explains why the 6 Shakespearean signatures that experts have deemed to be legitimate are all spelled differently. Though, again, some individuals have said, well, this person couldn't even spell his name. How could he write these plays? But again, it would not be unusual to spell things differently. But what ends up happening is that language was oftentimes being created at the time. Sometimes it was incorporated. Sometimes it was never used again. Sometimes it was just created for a particular situation. A word was just made up and never used again. They didn't have standard dictionaries. And at the time, what you would find is that certainly even if language was standardized eventually, language might have different meanings in that time period than it might have today. The word die, D-I-E, is a very good example. In our contemporary times, if you were to look in a contemporary dictionary, it means the ending of life. Or perhaps the singular of dice. If you know that dice, those squares that have little dots on them, 2 of them are dice. One is known as a die. During Shakespeare's time, it meant something quite different. The word die meant orgasm. So when you have a character who says, I die upon your lap, there's a lot of sexual punning and innuendo that goes on there that we modern day audiences would probably miss. But I mention this because occasionally you will have an editor who defines a word for you. This is why it's important to have a good edition with footnotes, because the editor is trying to anticipate what you as reader would need to find or explain. And some editors do a better job than others. Occasionally, an editor will define a word with a question mark afterwards, which means this is the editor's best guess as to what that word meant during the time period. And I say all of this to you in that you don't necessarily have to understand every single word of Shakespeare. You want to try to get an essence of it, because even the scholars and the critics sometimes debate what the language is and what it might mean. But that said, there's going to be much less to interpret than we would interpret with the translation, much like Oedipus the King. So, in terms of thinking about Shakespeare's writing, he wrote plays, and he also wrote sonnets, which are poems, very structured, stylized pieces of poetry that had very strict rules. something we talked about at the beginning of the semester when we were talking about a short story, the Sorrowful Woman, or A Sorrowful Woman, I should say, and how she was contemplating writing a sonnet. And we'll talk about the sonnets during our poetry section, but basically we think that Shakespeare mostly wrote his sonnets during times of plague, when the theater houses would have been shut down for fear of spread of the plague. His plays are usually divided into genres: comedies, histories, tragedies, and tragicomedies. In that order. Again, there's so much dispute about Shakespeare, we're not even necessarily exactly sure when the plays were written. But it seems that most of Shakespeare's comedies came at the beginning of his career. The comedies are usually viewed to not necessarily have the depth and sophistication of some of the other kinds of plays. So again, this is indicative of his early career. And then the histories, the tragedies, for what Shakespeare's probably best known for, and the tragic comedies. And that's how he ended his career. And the comedies had certain rules, as we will see with A Midsummer Night's Dream. Yes, they had to be comedic. They had to have a certain level of humor to them, which you might miss with reading the play, which again, I hope that you get by actually watching a production. A lot of the humor is slapstick. But humor was the least of it. In order to have a comedy, the main criteria was that it was about love and all of the complications associated with love. But all of those complications would be resolved at the end, so we could have a happy ending, which would mean marriage, or at least the promise of marriage. And these comedies are probably similar to rom-coms or romantic comedies in our world today. They would also have lots of music and dance associated with them. They were very celebratory. And that's also something that you might miss when you're reading, the music and dance that you would definitely get in a production. In fact, we think that these comedies were oftentimes written for performance immediately before or after a wedding. So there's a celebratory element to it. History plays were just that. They examined British history, and that's the important part. Not just any history, the history of England. And these were an opportunity for audiences to feel a certain level of patriotism. It was also an opportunity for Shakespeare to make some political commentary, which could be very dangerous at the time. You could be very open about sex and violence at the time, but not about politics. But Shakespeare very cleverly made political commentary by talking about political situations from the past. And if it just so happened that they had parallels to political situations of the present, so be it. But as Shakespeare, with a wink and a nod, would put forth all of his histories. His tragedies, and these are the plays like Hamlet and Macbeth and Othello and King Lear, about a great man above and beyond the ordinary who experiences downfall, in part because of outside forces, but also a flaw or flaws in character. And you probably recognize this definition. This is the definition that was established with Oedipus the King. Now, that said, Shakespeare would oftentimes change things to suit his purposes. So he didn't necessarily always follow the definitions of what a tragic character would do, especially in terms of accepting responsibility, which, if you know the plays Macbeth and Othello, it's somewhat problematic as to whether or not responsibility is accepted. And then we've got the tragic comedies, which basically were combinations. They had some dark elements that you would expect in a tragedy, but some lighthearted elements that you would expect in comedies, like the happy ending and the music and the dance. We think Shakespeare wrote these at the ending of his career, and the very last play we think Shakespeare wrote before his retirement would have been a play called The Tempest, which not only is a tragic comedy, but also follows the criteria that Aristotle had laid out, not just for a tragedy, but for theater in general, that it should keep to the unity of time and place, that you don't want audiences to have to suspend disbelief too much. So we already have to suspend disbelief when we're watching a play. So the unity of time. If a play takes place over the course of about 2 hours or so for us to watch, then the action should take place over the same length of time. Shouldn't take place over months or years, because obviously we're not sitting there for months or years. And it should have a unity of place, that once the stage has been established as a particular locale, we stay in this locale and we don't move around. If you know anything about Shakespeare's plays, he didn't keep to the unity of time and place until his very last play, that play The Tempest, which is usually read as Shakespeare's goodbye to his audience, telling us that he's planning on retiring, and also showing us that he could have kept to the rules of unity in time and place. He could have kept to any of the rules if he felt like it. He just didn't want to. So it wasn't that he didn't know how to do it. He's perfectly capable of doing it and doing it well. But he wanted to do something different, which is what I think we see with some of the tragedies. But in order to truly understand Shakespeare's tragedies, you've got to understand Oedipus the King. So, nevertheless, we aren't focusing on the tragedies. We're focusing on the comedies, which are about love and all of its misunderstandings. And this is a notoriously complex play, Midsummer Night's Dream, to reinforce the theme that love is notoriously complex and that love is fickle and that one lover is just as good as another, even though we think that our lovers are unique. I suggest that you keep a chart of all of the love relationships that will constantly be changing over the course of the play. In some respects, it's like a soap opera, if you're familiar with soap operas. There are love relationships that are constantly changing. So even though comedies are happy plays, they oftentimes have some rather dark commentary about love, and that love may be superficial and not necessarily as real as we believe it is, though at the ending, again, we assume a happy ending. And, of course, Midsummer Night's Dream is only one example of a comedy. If you ever take a Shakespeare class, if you take my Shakespeare class, actually, we begin with A Midsummer Night's Dream, so you get to revisit that. But you also get to read another comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. And you will see also that the comedies and all of Shakespeare's plays have lots of subplots. So it's not just one story, it's multiple stories. And they will all be connected to one another. And you can expect 5 acts in all of Shakespeare's plays, regardless of the genre. And they sort of work like a pyramid. So Act 1 would be on the lower left-hand side of the pyramid. This is the introduction to characters. This can be particularly complex if you're just reading a play because you need to keep all the characters straight. Act 2 is the beginning of the height of conflict or tension. Act 3 is the height of tension. And Act 4 is when we get the beginning of resolution. Act 5 is when we get resolution. And if Act 3 is at the tip of the pyramid, then Act 4 is in the middle of the descent of the pyramid on the right-hand side. And then Act 5 is the direct opposite from Act 1. It's at the bottom of the pyramid, but on the right side rather than the left. So you can sort of expect that progression of action. Midsummer is just ever so slightly different because it seems as if the play ends in Act 4, and we don't need Act 5. It almost seems like it's tacked on. But trust me, nothing was done accidentally by Shakespeare. That Act 5 is just as important as any of the other acts. It's a commentary on everything that we've seen. And you should expect that Shakespeare would be writing for all levels of audience because the plays at the time were the television of the day. So the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the educated and the non-educated, royalty and laborers, all went to see plays. Of course, the more money you had, the more comfortable your seating, so that if you could afford expensive seats, you could even perhaps afford a cushion on the seat, and the seat would have an awning that would cover it, that would protect it from the elements, because it's an open-air theater, because you would need to take advantage of the natural light, because there is no sunlight. Some irony here is that the least expensive seats weren't even seats. You had to stand in front of the stage. So it was uncomfortable, but perhaps you had the best view in town. So that said, as I had indicated with Oedipus and the Greek amphitheaters, the theater houses influence how ultimately a play is produced, which is where I wanted to draw your attention to the Globe Theater, Section 5 in the notes below, which looked like a wooden circular O with an open air roof. Again, all society attended, and while it was considered lowbrow, it was supported by the Queen. Boys would play the female roles because, again, it was seen as too unsavory for a woman to be involved in. It gives a completely different view to Romeo and Juliet when you think of an adolescent boy playing Juliet. Costumes very elaborate because there was a hierarchy in society, very much based on birthright. You were born into a particular position, and clothing would oftentimes denote your status. The colors you were able to wear, the fabrics you were able to wear. Our society is much more casual and informal in that respect. So you can tell a lot from the costuming, but you can't tell much from the props. The props were pretty minimal. It's not easy to put props on and off a stage, particularly when you're doing set changes. And I direct you to a link, shakespearesglobe.com, and you can see that in section 5. I'm going to ask you to click on that, where you will see some pictures of the Globe Theater. And the link below that also allows you to take a virtual tour of the Globe Theater. Now, the version of Midsummer we're going to watch was performed in the Globe Theater, so you can get a bit of a sense of what it would be like to experience it in the theater. A little bit of background about this theater, and you can see that it's got a very large stage that juts out. It's got an awning over the stage that allows for some of the machinery. We talked about it as Deus Ex Machina, God in the Machine, with Oedipus the King. This is where you could have ropes and pulleys to lower character down into stage or to raise them up into the heavens. The stage would have a trap door, which could represent hell, where you would have characters descend into hell or perhaps demons ascend onto the stage. And the stages were very elaborately painted, even though the props were quite minimal. The theater could seat several thousand people. So you think about a kind of sports arena is probably closer to what we would find with a Shakespearean theater. But the story I wanted to tell you about the theater goes back to, of all things, young Goodman Brown, when we were talking about the Puritans. Because basically Shakespeare's theater, after Shakespeare died, was torn down by the Puritans in England because theater was seen as evil. And all that existed was a little placard that said, this is where Shakespeare's theater stood. It was in the 1970s when an American actor by the name of Sam Wanamaker was on holiday to visit the Globe and saw that little placard instead of a theater, that he made it his lifelong mission to have that theater reconstructed. He had no money, he had no gravitas, he had no connections, but somehow, some way he did it. He did die before the opening of the theater, but he put together the best scholars that existed at the time so that they could put together the reconstructed Globe Theater as closely as possible to what actually existed during Shakespeare's time. Of course, scholarship is always undergoing review, so as time has progressed, some things have been found to be incorrect. The actors themselves will say that, in their opinion as actors, the stage seems too large. But again, this was the most recent scholarship of the day that helped to formulate the plans for that reconstructed Globe Theater, which you can see again in that link. I encourage you to click on it so you can take a little view, as well as the virtual tour. We can't go in person, but at least you can get an idea of what it would look like. And certainly when we watch A Midsummer Night's Dream, you'll be able to see what it would be like performed in the Globe Theater. And trust me when I tell you that when there is a production in the Globe Theater, the best of the best are the only ones who are allowed to perform in the Globe. So you'll see some very fine actors. Interesting point about the theater is that it was located in a kind of seedy part of town because it was viewed, again, playwriting as not very not very sophisticated. They weren't even allowed to advertise that they were performing plays. So what they would need to do is hang out a flag, almost like retail stores do now, to show that they were open, or in this instance, performing a play. And the color of the flag would denote the kind of play that was being shown. White would be a comedy. Black would be a tragedy, for instance. So one other piece of trivia about the theater is that Shakespeare's original Globe Theater, when they were using some stage effects, actually they were using a cannon, so they would oftentimes use things like cannons for stage effects or for special effects. The wadding of the cannon actually caught the roof of the Globe on fire. The roof was made out of thatching. The entire Globe burned down. But they rebuilt the Globe all over again, this time with a tile roof, so that it could withstand things like fire hazards. And the one with the tile roof is the one that was torn down by the Puritans after Shakespeare's death. And again, as I indicated, it wasn't until the 1970s that there was a drive to put together a reconstructed Globe Theater, which is where now they do performances of Shakespearean plays, as well as other performances as well. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of Shakespeare's time. It was also a time that was, as I had indicated, very much structured by hierarchy. So you were born in a particular position, and that should indicate your temperament. That's not to say Shakespeare didn't question that. Shakespeare questioned lots of things. He just didn't do it obviously. Again, keep in mind all the different levels he would have to write to in his audience. So you've got lots of punning and double entendres. But Shakespeare's plays are written in a mix of poetry or verse and prose, complete sentences. The idea is that poetry is reserved for the higher level orders and prose or complete sentences for the lower levels. But Shakespeare would mix that up, have the lower levels in the play talk poetry to show that just because you're born in a position, that doesn't mean you can't be lofty. And likewise, you can have a higher level character speaking in prose or complete sentences to show descent. So it was a subtlety like this one that allowed Shakespeare to make political commentary without getting himself into political trouble. And it was a tense time politically because of Queen Elizabeth, who was known as the Virgin Queen. She had never married. That's why she was known as the Virgin Queen. So there were no direct heirs. So it was unclear as to who would take over the position after Queen Elizabeth. And it was already a difficult political situation to have Queen Elizabeth take over because there were no male heirs, so they had to go to the closest female heir. But in Elizabeth's case, and she was aging, so it was just a question of time before she died, there were no heirs, male or female. So, of course, there were lots of questions that you wouldn't ask publicly because that could get you into a whole bunch of trouble. But Shakespeare could address these, especially in his history plays. His first history play happened to be about the question of who has the right to rule. Basically, is it based on birthright, the one that has the closest birthright to royalty? Or is it based on ability and temperament, even though you may not necessarily have the birthright? Which was a question that people were contemplating as they were thinking about what's going to happen when Queen Elizabeth dies. But again, they didn't necessarily state out loud. But that said, that's for another class if you happen to be interested in learning more about Shakespeare. We aren't focusing on the history plays. We are focusing on the comedies, which is where we're going to begin next class with A Midsummer Night's Dream. So again, our attendance question due by noon on Saturday, but if you need additional time, please let me know. Do you have any questions about Oedipus the King? And if so, what are those questions? If you have no questions, you can say no questions, and then we're done. And then we can begin Oedipus the next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I will see you next week, so to speak. Take care. Bye-bye.